Hi, Misha here, and kind of doing a newer, at least alternative look at some of the Eagle Moss ships, just for fun. I've been doing a lot of main channel videos lately. I needed a break. And kind of in the first episode of this, I looked at the TNG era ships, next generation era ships derived from the Galaxy class, kind of in that family. Say, 2330 through 2370, that time frame. And I'm kind of looking at these in more of a beta canon or head canon way, and also talking about video games in the sense that, as I recounted in that video, I couldn't play video games as such, but back when Armada and Armada 2 were out, I would code mods, edits, mostly putting in ships and editing them. And my main overall goal when I was doing my main kind of mod or patch or conversion was to make the games more canon, more on-screen accurate. And of course that meant that while I was able to add a few new Klingon and Romulan ships, I mostly ended up adding a slew of Federation ships. So I'll talk about that a bit. And here we have the early movie era ships, kind of the ships ranging from right after the original series up through right before the introduction of the Excelsior. And these are pretty much all derived from the Constitution refit, or the Enterprise class, if you will. So with that, let's just get into the three Connies on the table. In the first episode, I showed you the Probert Concept Enterprise C. Well, here we have the Concept Enterprise from the aborted Phase 2, which was to be a television series. And of course, Eagle Moss took a little bit of poetic license with this to make it fit in with the fleet because, well, the series never was created. But this is really a combination of the original series. We still have pretty much the same deflector, but then we have the newer style swept-back nacelles and pylons, and we have a slightly newer style of bridge module. So it's kind of the in-between. So in headcanon, I could say this is the Constitution V 1.5. Maybe something, if this wasn't the Enterprise, made after the original 12 Connies, maybe in the very late 2260s, kind of in between. And the main thing is it would have the newer warp system. Originally, the Connie had a max speed of warp 8, old scale, and the Refit had a max speed of warp 9, old scale. So, one step up warp. It also had stronger phasers and updated photons. But yeah, this would be a transitional ship, and is pretty much the oldest model on the table. And if we were doing a game, this would be maybe a base level. This would still technically be a heavy cruiser, although by later standards probably a medium cruiser. Of course, we don't really know any service history because this never really was seen on screen except for in diagrams and whatnot. In Eagle Moss, this is a bonus, like I said, not a standard edition. In universe, it would have been about 300 meters long, with a crew of 400 to 450. I like it though. It's a sleek take on the classic TOS Connie, and that's pretty cool. And of course, it's just showing what's to come. Here we have both versions of the Enterprise, the original refit, seen in the first 3 films, and the Enterprise A, seen in the last 3 films. The Eagle Moss models are identical except for a different paint scheme, because in the real world they use the same studio miniature. So, yeah. But being a completionist, I ended up picking up both because, why not? These are both standard editions. And I think a lot of us like the Connie Refit a lot. It's a classic ship. And of course, the Constitution was the only Federation ship, or at least Starfleet ship, we saw for the entire original series and in the first motion picture. In universe, this was about 305 meters long, had a crew of 430. It was considered a heavy cruiser, a deep space explorer, also a combat ship. It had heavy-duty phasers, it had dual photon launchers, a very ample shuttle bay. And yeah, it was the mainstay and still the pride of the fleet. Maybe aging because the Enterprise herself was originally launched in 2245. So by this point, she's gone through a couple of refits. But you know, 25 years is not very old for a warship in even modern Earth. And one would assume that a space frame like this was built to last. So there are plenty of real-world ships. I mean, look at the Iowa classes. Commissioned in the 1940s, they were used in active combat up through the 1990s. So 50 years. And that's not uncommon. But yeah, this would be the heavy hitter. The aging was still tough battleship, warship, but also it would be a little expensive in terms of personnel and resources to operate. And a lot of Constitutions were lost during the various excursions. In fact, that's what kind of made the Enterprise famous. Was it was the really the only Constitution to return unscathed, or at least relatively so. Most of the rest of the Connies, they didn't get off too easy. Sorry, I'm having trouble getting out of the stand here. Pop in there. It's a little thing it pops in. But, yeah, this is the ship. There we go, I think. There we go. Good news is it sits in here really good, because it kind of hugs the star drive. Again, the Refit and the A in Universe were the same model, although they were lit differently. And one would assume, since the Refit was, a refit, and the A was actually a purpose-built ship, that there would be some differences, at least whatnot. The A should be a little bit better, more modern systems. There's only so much you can do with the Refit. But yeah, you know what, you love it, the Connie, and that's kind of what the rest of these are based on to greater or lesser extents. Now here we have another bonus edition, and this is another prototype. This is the Concept USS Reliant. But if we're having beta cannon or head cannon, this can be another class. Really, it can. The nacelles are on top, and we have these two pods on the bottom, which could be weapons pods, but they don't look especially like weapons pods. They could be redundant deflectors, two small ones instead of one big one, or they could be long-range sensors. I would tend to go with sensors, personally. It also seems to have some ample shuttle bays in the back. And we do know that the Reliant herself, the USS Reliant, was in service in 2267. And it's presumed that originally it would look more like the Constitution with the old school nacelles, and then was rebuilt retrofit in the 2270s. And this is just another one of the ships in the fleet. We might want to call this the Avenger class, which was kind of an early name for what would become the Miranda, or the Anton class, which probably is more fitting. This doesn't look like a super combat vessel. I would honestly say it looks more like a science ship, a survey ship, a patrol ship, medium cruiser, or even a cargo ship or tug, kind of like the Ptolemy class from the old FASA days. I'm really glad they did this, because it's another ship for our movie era fleet. Even if it's really just a concept, it looks different and cool. I love how the nacelles sweep back and they're on top. So what do you think? I'm not sure this is one that a lot of people have seen, but I really like it. I think it fits into the lineage really well. And at least tell you it's not just another Connie. So yeah, if I was doing this in a game, this would probably be a support ship, a sensor craft, a patrol craft, you know, a medium cruiser, and probably would have good cargo carrying abilities. Looks like it would. But the next ship, that's more combat. Here we have the Soyuz class, one of my all-time favorites, and not just because it's named after a Russian space vehicle. You might consider this a Miranda variant, but in universe it's not. It's considered its own class. In the real world, we first see this in the 5th season episode of Next Generation, where it's piloted by Dr. Fraser. Well, Captain, I should say. In universe, this is a patrol ship, a cutter. I would consider it a frigate, maybe, or heavy destroyer, even though it is actually about 245 meters long and has a pretty ample crew of at least 200. Some people who are in the idea that the Federation's not a military will say that these are sensors. And hey, if you can get the Klingons and Romulans to believe that, good for you, but we both know they're guns. These are definitely early phaser cannons. As I've said in other videos, in the real world, they actually took guns, cannons, turrets off of model battleships and plugged them in here. Another thing this has over the standard Miranda, it has an enlarged kind of shuttle bay, cargo bay area extension off the hull in the back. So that would kind of give it credence as a patrol craft, having more shuttles to extend range and whatnot and support it. I just think it looks really neat. I mean, considering it was just seen on screen briefly in one episode, they didn't have to do this, and to be fair, all they did was stick some things on the model, but yeah. So if I was doing a game, this would definitely be a gunboat. No question, no hesitation, gunboat. It's got lots of guns. Maybe make it a little weak defensively, or, you know, give it some of the shortcomings, but it would be a good ship you could spam them with and, you know, defend installations with, or send to support a larger fleet, or yeah, just patrol a border, patrol territory. I really did enjoy programming the game years ago, and again, it let me integrate with friends and whatnot. I think it's where I really kind of started to develop an appreciation for stats and whatnot for Starfleet and other Star Trek ships. I was working with them. And I'm really happy that Eagle Moss did this model and did it very well. You don't see these often, but this seems to be one of the main ships in the 2270s for the Starfleet. Next up, we have one of the first Miranda variants we see in the Next Generation. This is the Lantry. Often, I think it's referred to as a Class 6. But either way, it's a cargo ship, a transport, a freighter. And yeah, it has a very simple appearance to it. It's basically just a saucer with the, you know, long extension in the back. It's by about 235 meters. Nacelles. Yeah, cargo ship. And it had a crew of around 25 to 35, depending on the ship, which left actually a lot of volume inside for cargo, which is good. I mean, you don't really need a huge crew for a freighter. And since this was a versatile and modular space frame, why not? Now, we see this in Next Generation, a time when the Miranda class is already aging. So that makes sense why it would be used as a supply ship. It's durable, still, you know, perfectly good on the warp. Able to hit warp 9, at least old scale, cruise at warp 6. You would have some basic defense, but we don't see any added weapons pods, so probably not a whole lot. I'm not even sure if it even has photons. Could just have phaser arrays. But yeah, the cargo ship could also be used as a survey craft or patrol ship in a pinch, but pretty much its variant. And this one finally came out for the Eagle Moss collection, even though it's a simple ship. I was actually very excited. I just kind of like the simple utilitarian look of some of these ships. Obviously, if you did a game, you would use the Lantry type as a freighter or transport. But here is the real Reliant. Initially known as the Avenger class, at least informally. Later, the Next Generation formally established this as the Miranda. And this is the medium cruiser variant. The Constitution's got all the glory and were the pride of the fleet, but this was the workhorse of the fleet. In the other video, I talked about the Nebulas. Well, this was the obvious forerunner of the Nebulas. Modular, upgradable, customizable. About 235 to 240 meters long, depending on the variant. Crew of about 200, at least this version. So, yeah, a little easier to crew. Half the crew of a Constitution. Still very capable, up to warp 9 with a cruise of warp 7. And this has added weapons on this so-called roll bar. We have photons that can fire front or aft. And we have kind of pulse phaser arrays that, well, deliver pulses. So this is, at least can be, a more combat-oriented. Although when we see it in Wrath of Khan, it's used as more of a science and survey craft. But then again, maybe they were just simply available, and why not employ them for that? Yeah, this would definitely be something you would use to defend your borders. And they could go toe-to-toe with many other alien craft out there. Miranda was a very, very capable starship. And honestly could be operated by a relatively small crew, as we saw with Khan's folks. Whereas the Constitution required considerably more individuals. It's also just a more compact, streamlined hull with everything on this central area. It has around 11 decks, but most are concentrated in the main deck here. Also has ample shuttle bays in the back. And as we saw with the Lantry type, the roll bar can be removed to designate for other roles. And this would definitely be in service in the 2270s, and it would continue in service throughout the next century. It's just a good space frame. And if you're doing a game, yeah, this would be this a small, solid ship that would get things done and could be used for lots of roles. Just a good workaday ship that wouldn't cost an arm and a leg to build. Next up, we have the Saratoga type, as seen in Best of Both Worlds. Well, I guess that technically Emissary. You know what I mean, the Battle of Wolf 359. This was Sisko's ship, and the one his wife died on. And it's your basic Miranda, no roll bar. This seems to be a science variant, because we have these two large sciencey pods, sensor pods that do sciencey sensor things on the sides. Now, I will believe these are science pods, not weapons. They don't quite look like weapons, and yeah, that would make more sense. And we do see from Emissary that this one does have some weapons kind of moved to the inside of the hull, but because of this, it would take up some of the internal volume. And by this point, this is, yeah, more of a science ship or light cruiser by the 24th century. Even though the design is the same size, that's kind of how it works. You know, in World War I, ships that were considered heavy dreadnoughts, heavy battleships, were considered cruisers or fast battleships in World War II. And they were actually still making Mirandas during the 2350s and even 2360s perhaps, and they were still very much in service through the 2370s. And this is just one of their many variants and showing their just flexibility. So I would definitely use this in a game as a sensor ship, a science ship, a research ship, maybe a planetary survey ship. Might be good for detecting cloak ships too. And again, as I've said in the other video, one nice thing about Eagle Moss, when they do the variants like this, they don't use just the same mold. They actually retool each one, even though they probably wouldn't have to, but they're actually slightly different scales, just if you put them side by side, which is just an appreciated neat fact, in my opinion. And here we have our final Miranda variant, and the last one released in the standard collection. Issue 150, I think. This is the Antares or Antares variant or class type. And again, it looks pretty much the same from below. The differences are on the top. We have this pod that's kind of reminiscent. Well, it's kind of a cross between the AWACS pod of the Phoenix Nebula and the weapons pod of the Honshu. So you could say it's kind of either one, a sensor pod or a weapons pod on top, or both. And then we have two smaller pods here that almost look like the kind of pulse phasers from the original Miranda type. So this seems to be a combat version. In the show, Deep Space Nine, we see this being used to defend and patrol around a starbase. And by this point, the vessel's aging enough that it's really considered a fast destroyer or heavy destroyer. And that's what they're used in. They're kind of used in wings. They're inexpensive, they're tried and true design. Again, they need a relatively small crew to operate. And you can pop different modules and pods on. And since they were making new space frames, it's perfectly believable that they would keep a good design like this in production, at least in some capacity. And this one's just kind of neat that they did it because it's such a background ship. You know, the others, the Saratoga, the Lantry, the Miranda itself, even the Soyuz, you know, they were featured pretty up close in at least an episode. But this was just a background little blip just to give some, you know, color and movement to the screen. So it's kind of neat that they did it. And as I was saying about the Saratoga, you can tell that it's its own mold because the saucer is actually a little bit smaller than that on the Saratoga to make room for the AWACS pod. Probably not my favorite one. I don't know. I do like it. It's a neat looking ship. It does make the Miranda look kind of modern-esque. Yeah, that's how they did it. We pretty much have all the Miranda variants. The only one we don't have is the CGI Dominion War refit. But that would be hard to do because basically it was the same as standard except additional impulse engine. But yeah, in a game this would be a good fast destroyer, quick assault ship, or just a cheap little ship to patrol an outpost or kind of, I don't know, farming planet. But yeah, really glad they did it. Moving right along, we have the Sydney class, the USS Janolan from the episode with Scotty. Now, I could not do this one here because it's not clearly inspired by the Connie saucer and what have you. But one, I like it. And two, what they basically did is they took a transport and they slapped a Connie-style bridge on top to give it perspective, scale. And they gave it Connie-style nacelles. This is 230 meters long. Several decks. She's pretty thick. And essentially this is like the Boeing 747. It's a transport, long-range transport. It can carry 200 people or more, probably quite a bit more, but comfortably across Federation space. So it's not a combat ship. This is very clearly a transport, a hauler of people. But it does have sensors and other assets that you'd expect of a starship. It is a proper starship. Just one with a different purpose, and that's okay. Not everything needs to be a combat ship or a deep space explorer. It does have reasonably good shields, probably has at least defensive weaponry, and since it has these engines and nacelles, it's probably reasonably fast. These are in service in the late 23rd century, and we still see some operating at the time of the Dominion War, which again makes sense. Look how long the Boeings have been around. So that's definitely what it would be used for in any kind of game environment. Then I just wanted to bring it out because I think a lot of people like it, and it's a very good size model too. Very thick, very heavy and chunky. It's not one you see every day. Not a lot of models and even toy makers have done the Janolan here. And it's in a really cool episode. And again, this is one we get to see up close at least a few times. And this is kind of a waste not, want not thing of them modifying the orbital shuttle by just tacking on a few things to change its scale and whatnot. Make it a much larger vessel. But hey, it works. And now we come to the Constellation, kind of the last major variant in the Constitution S look. And really sorry, I pointed you the wrong way. And really the first non-hero ship we saw for the Federation in the Next Generation. And originally they were just going to make the Stargazer a Constitution, but they decided to go a little different. And so they made it a Constitution Kit Bash. We've got 4 of its nacelles, even having the kind of little round thing in the back, I guess impulse crystal or whatever you want to call the thing. We have this extension, and then we have a saucer. It's essentially 2 tops of a Constitution saucer put together. So, I don't know, auxiliary bridge, why not? It also has this thing down here that looks like a Canon, but I think it's supposed to be a sensor. Call it what you will. And I'm not sure where the deflector is supposed to be. I'd imagine either here or here. I don't know. That said, I actually really like this design. It's kind of neat. This was in service by the 2280s. And was meant to be a deep space explorer and rapid response craft meant to go on long duration missions. She's a pretty good size. About 330 meters, a little longer than a Connie. And she had a crew of 500 to 550, so a larger crew than a Connie. And the idea was to make, well, something better, more capable, and step forward. Now, it was kind of a limited success, frankly, to be honest. But they were trying, and they definitely mass-produced these. We see the Stargazer, we see the Hathaway, we see the Victory, and a few others. So, and these are considered pretty much out of date by the time of Next Generation, but not hopelessly obsolete, I guess you would say. Just obsolete. This is one that Eagle Moss was always going to do, and I know some criticize this model for this or that, but I think it's pretty nice. I guess the deflector might be there. It's a good size, good weight, and it's a neat design. I like forward nacelle designs, just kind of a different look. So in a game, you would use this as a high-speed, long-range craft with reasonably good firepower, but it might be a little expensive to produce and crew. And kind of like with the Cheyenne, it might have kind of that new technology thing going on where it's not all it's cracked up to be. I wouldn't consider the Constellation a failure, but maybe it didn't quite live up to its full potential that the designers had hoped for. You might even say this is kind of what they tried before going to the Excelsior, because this was in service just a few years before the Excelsior. That would make sense. That idea to want something faster. And now time for our final ship. You know it, you love it, the Oberth. And at first this might not seem to be in the Connie lineage, but if you look at the warp nacelles, they're very similar, just compact. Very compacted saucer. And we have this big pod down here. I hesitate to call this a star drive. It never really seemed like a star drive to me. This seems like a science pod. Which would make sense because of the whole pylons getting down here. How would you get down? Yeah, that's a whole thing for another day. Seems like the main part of the ship is nice and up here. Your nacelles, engineering can be back here, and then workstations and whatnot up front in this compact saucer. It's about 150 meters long, so it's the smallest one here. Crew of about 80 on average. And yeah, this was a dedicated science and survey research, and also sometimes test bed, as we saw with the Pegasus. But the only time it would be in combat would be if it was being used as a support craft. Maybe for sensor feedback or medical ship or... yeah. And we saw this quite a bit early on in TNG, but really throughout the whole thing. It seems to be relatively new by the time of the motion pictures, but not exceedingly so. We know it has limited weapons and limited shields, but it also has very good sensors and things of that nature. But funnily enough, we still see these being used throughout the Next Generation movies, including at the Battle of Sector 001. Although I have to wonder if they put these in as almost a joke. It's the Oberth, it's kind of that. But it actually was a very capable craft for what it was. Inexpensive, whatnot. This would be a good scout craft, introductory craft, science craft in any video game. And the model from Eagle Moss here is actually one of their best efforts. It's very good size. The whole top is metal. The bottom hole here is the plastic. But it's a very good size. It's definitely one of their biggest. Which is kind of funny, but hey. Who doesn't like an Oberth? They're neat. And the design is just different. But it's still very clearly Starfleet. It doesn't look out of place. Just different. Which, if it's a science ship, makes perfect sense. And there you have it, folks. Just another look with the new camera. My musings and thoughts about the early motion picture, the Constitution era craft. Basically, yeah, it breaks down to the Constitutions, the Mirandas, and then you have a few outliers like the Constellation and the Oberth. But I decided to split these apart from the Excelsior types because otherwise it'd be much too long of a video. And that's what we'll get to next time, looking at the derivatives of the good old great experiment, the Excelsior. Al Gore's favorite ship. So let me know what you think of these, your favorite or one you hate. Feel free to leave comments, as always. I appreciate you tuning in. This is Misha, and I'll catch you very soon next time.